You don't meet evil in some cinematic showdown. You meet it in a subtle glance, in a dismissive comment, in the way someone makes you doubt your own voice. Slowly, invisibly, and without apology. Evil doesn't walk through the front door wearing horns. It sits across from you at dinner, asks you how your day was, and then questions your reality without ever raising its voice. And the worst part is, you'll second guess yourself. Because bad people don't advertise themselves. They're charming, they're generous when it counts, they're intelligent, they're likable, even magnetic, but that is precisely the trap. The question isn't whether they're polite, the question is what they do with your vulnerability once they've earned your trust. They never hold the mirror up to themselves unless it's to adjust the mask. That's the first thing you have to understand. The concept of responsibility for them is not a principle, it's a threat, because to admit fault is to relinquish control, and they can't afford that. Control is the very oxygen they breathe, so they flip the script every time, no matter the conflict, no matter the context, no matter how glaringly obvious the damage they've done, they find a way to make it your fault. Not explicitly at first. That would be too easy to detect. No, they start subtle. You're being too sensitive. That's not what I meant. You always overreact, and just like that, your pain becomes the evidence against you. This is not random. It's a defense mechanism engineered through years of avoiding shame, because shame, to them, is annihilation. It threatens the image they've built, that they are intelligent, composed, morally superior. So if something goes wrong, it simply cannot be because of them. The alternative is psychological collapse, and they've built too many walls to allow for that. They will twist logic to the point where reality becomes unrecognizable. You catch them in a lie, and suddenly it's your fault for snooping. You express your disappointment, and now you're emotionally manipulative. You set a boundary, and suddenly you're abandoning them. It's always a reversal. You are cast as the perpetrator, and they emerge as the misunderstood victim. This inversion isn't just manipulation, it's survival. If they accepted fault, they'd have to reevaluate the entire structure of their identity, and that structure is brittle. It's been reinforced by years of blame shifting, of deflecting, of building a personality around the absence of accountability. They've never had to face the fire, so they fear it more than anything. They bait you into guilt and then punish you for feeling it. They use your empathy against you, your capacity to consider other perspectives, to own your part, to reflect and apologize. But they never meet you there. They let you carry the emotional labor of both people, and then they resent you for being self-righteous when you finally speak up. They use the language of accountability without embodying it. They'll say things like, "I know I'm not perfect," or "I'm trying my best," but these are shields, not confessions. These are exit routes from real responsibility. They'll admit flaws in abstract terms, but never in direct proportion to the specific harm they've caused. That would be too concrete, too incriminating. Over time, this reversal starts to reshape you. You begin to doubt your memory, your judgment, your instincts. You stop bringing things up because every confrontation becomes an interrogation of your motives, not their behavior. You shrink your voice just to avoid the war that always erupts when you ask for something as basic as honesty or clarity. They will never change through confrontation alone, not because they can't, but because they won't. Admitting fault means relinquishing their moral high ground, and that high ground is the throne they've built their entire relational strategy on. From that height, they can always look down on you, always justify, always moralize, always explain away the impact of their actions as some kind of noble misunderstanding. They will even co-opt your pain as a strategy. If you cry, they sigh. If you express anger, they go silent. If you walk away, they paint you as the one who gave up. You can't win, because the rules shift the moment you get too close to the truth. You're not dealing with reason, you're dealing with a fortress of delusion disguised as charm, as intellect, as rationality. Even when others confront them, they lean into the same tactics. It's complicated. You don't know the whole story. I've been under a lot of pressure. They humanize themselves only when they're cornered, and even then it's performative. Not to heal, not to repair, but to protect the narrative that they are never truly responsible for the harm they cause. They are masters of narrative warfare, and the story they tell always ends with them surviving at the cost of your sanity. It's not about who was right, it's about who gets to define what happened. And if you let them, they'll rewrite the entire history of the relationship until you're the villain in a script they directed from day one. What they fear most isn't your anger, it's your clarity. Because once you see the pattern, once you stop arguing and start observing, once you name the inversion out loud, they lose the advantage. They can no longer operate behind the smokescreen of doubt. And for someone who cannot survive the weight of their own reflection, that is the beginning of unraveling. They don't come at you with open hostility. That would be too obvious, too easy to push back against. Instead, they choose the quiet method, the surgical approach. They don't strike, they erode, they chip away at your confidence, one small comment at a time, so gently that you can't quite pinpoint when the decay began. They couch everything in the language of concern. Are you sure you want to wear that? That's an interesting idea, but maybe too ambitious. You've always been a little impulsive. These statements don't scream insult, but they linger in your mind, quietly rearranging your self-perception until their voice becomes your inner critic. Their tactic is psychological sleight of hand. They never deliver the blow where you expect it. They use implication, not accusation. Their undermining lives between the lines, in the pause, in the look, in the raised eyebrow. It's not what they say, it's what they almost say, what they leave out, and what they imply without having to own it. They'll joke, just teasing, but the jab hits where it hurts. They'll label you dramatic if you react, insecure if you question it, so you learn to stay quiet, and that silence becomes fertile ground for their influence to grow. What they want is not to crush you, not immediately. What they want is for you to doubt yourself so much that you hand over your authority willingly. They observe you carefully. They note where you shine, where you're vulnerable, what excites you, what scares you, and then they tailor their subtle jabs to match. If you're proud of your independence, they'll make offhand comments about your coldness. If you care about your work, they'll call it an obsession. If you value kindness, they'll suggest you're too naive. They never attack your strengths directly. They invert them. This form of undermining is slow, methodical, and nearly invisible to outsiders. That's what makes it dangerous. No one else sees the pattern. No one else hears the tone in their voice when they say, "I'm just trying to help." They appear supportive on the surface, and that discrepancy between your experience and their image makes you feel like the crazy one. You begin to second-guess your instincts. You start explaining away the discomfort. You tell yourself you're being too sensitive, that they're just blunt, that you're imagining things. But deep down, something is shifting. You don't feel safe to express yourself anymore. You hesitate before speaking. You rehearse your words. That hesitation is the evidence of their influence. They play the long game. Because the goal isn't to hurt you, it's to reshape you. Not into a better version of yourself, but into a version that aligns with their control. And that transformation happens without you noticing until one day you wake up and realize you've been edited down into something smaller, more cautious, less alive. If you try to confront them, they will deny everything. You're reading too much into it. You're twisting my words. I can't say anything around you. They make you feel like the aggressor. They push you into emotional exile and then blame you for being cold. This is the trap. They provoke the wound, and when you bleed, they call you unstable. They always position themselves as the level-headed one, the calm one, the logical one. But that calm is manufactured. It's the calm of someone who's never truly exposed themselves, never risked vulnerability, never owned the full weight of their influence. And their logic is a weapon, not a path to truth. It's used to dismiss, not to understand. People like this are often deeply insecure, but they've mastered the art of masking it with detachment. They project confidence by subtracting your confidence. Their certainty exists only in contrast to your doubt, and if you begin to reclaim your voice, they will escalate the subtlety into something sharper. Sarcasm, judgment, intellectual superiority. They will try to keep you beneath them, one covert insult at a time. It's not uncommon for people who've been undermined like this to become shells of their former selves. Creative people lose their spark. Confident people become guarded. That transformation isn't weakness, it's the result of psychological warfare carried out in the softest tones and with the most polite words. And the worst part is the world rewards them because they appear composed, reasonable, thoughtful. No one sees the knife in their smile. No one hears the poison laced into their concern. So you carry the damage quietly, wondering if anyone else can see it or if it's just you. They speak in the language of principles, but they do not live by them. They quote justice, kindness, empathy, not to uphold these values, but to weaponize them. Their morality is not a compass, it is a costume. And that costume is tailored perfectly for the role they want to play in your life. You see, people who use morality as camouflage have no intention of becoming better. They only want to appear better. Their concern isn't for truth. Their concern is for perception, how they are viewed, how they are talked about, how easily they can deflect scrutiny by projecting righteousness. They'll say all the right things. They'll advocate for integrity, fairness, honesty. But watch closely. Their actions rarely align. Their truth-telling is selective. Their fairness only benefits them. Their honesty is partial, convenient, and almost always aimed outward. Because their moral compass doesn't point north, it points to their ego. They speak compassion but practice coercion. They use empathy as a trap. If you were truly kind, you'd forgive me. If you were really spiritual, you wouldn't be so angry. These aren't requests for dialogue. These are demands for silence. These phrases are structured to disarm you, to make your pain seem petty in the face of their supposed enlightenment. And this is where the damage starts. Because if you care about morality, if you hold values deeply, they know they can control you through those very values. They know you'll hesitate before judging. They know you'll reflect, question, and carry guilt. So they build their strategy around your conscience and then twist it until you believe you are the one failing the moral standard. They often have reputations as good people, the kind of individuals who help others, speak well, maybe even lead communities. But behind closed doors, there is manipulation, control, a complete lack of introspection. They perform virtue publicly while weaponizing it privately. And the contrast is so stark it leaves their targets disoriented, confused, and emotionally cornered. What they fear most is exposure, not because they believe they're wrong, but because the power of their disguise is rooted in the illusion of moral authority. If the mask slips, the entire architecture of their influence collapses, so they protect the mask at all costs, even if it means sacrificing your reputation, your credibility, or your peace. They're not accountable, they're performative. They'll apologize only when it serves their image. They'll admit to imperfections, but only in the most abstract, sanitized terms. I've made mistakes. I'm learning. But they never name the wound. They never look their victim in the eye and speak with full clarity about the harm they've caused, because then the illusion breaks. They preach growth while remaining stagnant. They use the language of healing to avoid confrontation. I'm working on myself becomes a shield that delays all responsibility. And if you press too hard, suddenly you're the toxic one. You're the aggressive one. They twist the moral framework so that any challenge to them becomes immoral by default. They're obsessed with appearing good, not being good. That's why they gravitate toward causes, roles, ideologies that can be used as status symbols. They'll champion justice, but be cruel to their partner. They'll speak of empathy, but mock those closest to them behind their backs. The morality is selective, and their selection process is driven entirely by convenience and control. They curate their image carefully. Every post, every word, every action is calculated to reinforce their identity as virtuous. But what they cannot fake, at least not indefinitely, is consistency. If you observe long enough, you'll see the inconsistencies. You'll see how quickly the mask cracks when they're challenged, when they're questioned, when someone sees too much. They'll accuse others of what they do themselves. If they lie, they'll call you dishonest. If they manipulate, they'll call you controlling. This is not a mistake, this is projection. It's a brilliant diversion tactic. If they can paint you as the moral failure, they protect themselves from examination. They steal the language of ethics to preempt any critique, and when you finally speak up, when you say, "This doesn't feel right," they don't engage. They gaslight. You're being judgmental. I thought you were more compassionate than this. So much for unconditional love. These phrases are designed to flip the script and cast you as the one who's failed to live up to the ideal they themselves never honored. They align themselves with whatever moral narrative is trending. If kindness is currency, they'll perform it. If activism is power, they'll join the cause. But watch how quickly their convictions dissolve when there's no audience. Their ethics are not rooted, they're opportunistic. They adjust to what earns them admiration, status, or leverage. This kind of person doesn't just hurt you, they make you question your own goodness. That's the most devastating part. You begin to wonder if you're the problem, if your pain is proof of your moral failure, if setting boundaries makes you cruel, and that internal conflict is exactly what they count on to keep you quiet. They aren't interested in truth, they're interested in winning. And in their world, morality isn't a guide, it's a weapon. And if they can make you feel like the villain in your own story, they win. Not because they were right, but because you stopped fighting back. You don't realize what happened until it's too late, until you've apologized for your own wounds, until you've tried to prove your virtue to someone who never intended to recognize it, until you've rewritten your values to make room for someone who only ever used them as tools for domination. They don't seek harmony, they seek dominance. But they understand that outright power grabs are too transparent, so they employ something older, something more insidious. They divide. And once division takes root, they conquer without resistance. They pit people against each other not through chaos, but through quiet suggestion. A whispered comment here, a raised eyebrow there, an offhand remark designed to seed mistrust. They plant the thought and then step back to let it grow on its own. They know that conflict is easier to harvest than resolution. Their genius lies in how subtle they make it look. It's never, don't trust her. It's, I'm not sure she's being fully honest with you. It's not, he's against you. It's, you know how he gets when he feels threatened. These aren't accusations, they're narrative shifts. And they don't point fingers, they guide your eyes towards suspicion. They use triangulation as a default mode. That means they'll talk to person A about person B, then to person B about person A, all while maintaining the image of neutrality. They become the trusted center, the only one who understands both sides. And when conflict erupts, they act innocent as though the chaos emerged from nowhere. You start trusting them more because you believe they're the only one being honest. You don't realize they're managing perceptions, not relationships. They manipulate communication flow like a dam controls water, not to serve the people, but to preserve their own structure. They exploit the human need for connection. If they see two people getting close, they feel threatened. Not because love is bad, but because loyalty that isn't directed toward them is dangerous. So they start undermining the bond. A misinterpreted comment here, a rephrased conversation there, and soon enough, trust begins to erode. They're particularly skilled at provoking insecurity. They'll highlight another person's flaws when speaking to you, and yours when speaking to them. They'll say things like, I think she's intimidated by your strength, or he's always been kind of jealous of your success. These comments sound supportive, but their true purpose is to isolate you. They don't want relationships around them. They want satellites orbiting, dependent, constantly returning for guidance. The moment someone else becomes a source of stability for you, they subtly start dismantling that bridge. They don't destroy it directly, they just make you doubt it. What makes them so dangerous is that they often appear helpful, they give advice, offer support, present themselves as mediators, but they're not fixing problems. They're reinforcing their centrality. The more people rely on them to solve things, the more power they accumulate. They become the gatekeeper of peace. And if you catch on, if you start to see the pattern, they'll gaslight you. You're being paranoid. I was just trying to help. Why would I lie to you? These statements aren't just denials, they're confidence erasers. They push you to question your own perception, even when the evidence is staring you in the face. They thrive in environments of ambiguity. If things are too clear, too open, too direct, they lose their leverage. So they create fog. They blur the lines of who said what, who did what, and who's to blame. They manipulate emotional tone more than content. The goal isn't clarity, it's confusion. In families, they play siblings against each other. In friend groups, they split alliances. In workplaces, they create subtle rivalries, all under the guise of being objective. But their real motive is fragmentation, because when everyone's divided, no one has enough strength or clarity to resist them. They often speak in absolutes about others, but withhold details. Trust me, you don't know the whole story. That phrase alone creates distance. It tells you there's danger somewhere without proof. It makes you suspicious but leaves you without clarity. That's by design. Suspicion without evidence is control. They present themselves as the wounded healer, the one who's been wronged, the one who's just trying to protect you, the one with the heavy burden of knowing too much. They cloak themselves in victimhood to gain trust and deflect criticism. If you question them, you're attacking someone who's just trying to help. When someone else confronts them, they shift narratives instantly. They'll say you misunderstood, that you're emotional, that things were taken out of context. They never address the core manipulation. Instead, they reframe the conversation until they look like the reasonable ones surrounded by instability. They prefer indirect aggression. They rarely confront directly. That would expose their intentions. Instead, they rely on others to carry out their chaos. They create pressure points and watch the fractures appear. Then they step in to mediate, reinforcing their role as the only stabilizing force. The real tragedy is how often they succeed, because most people don't expect betrayal to come dressed as concern. Most people look for enemies that confront, not ones that console. And by the time people recognize the pattern, the relational structure is already fractured beyond recognition. They often come across as emotionally intelligent because they are, but that intelligence is not used for connection, it's used for domination. They read people well, but not to serve them, to steer them. They know your wounds, your insecurities, your blind spots, and they use them all. Once you're isolated, you become dependent. You stop trusting your intuition, your memory, your perception. You defer to them because they've subtly convinced you that everyone else is unreliable, and that false belief is the final key in their psychological handcuff. They never just want your affection, they want your allegiance. Affection can be shared, allegiance can't. And so they fracture every relationship that threatens their monopoly over your trust, and they do it so quietly that you begin to think the damage was your fault. They leave people paranoid, guarded, uncertain, and still somehow grateful for their presence. That is the mastery of division. When the architect of your confusion convinces you they're the only one who truly understands, certainly, here's a 20-paragraph expansion of They Crave Control, Not Connection, written with psychological intensity, sharp observation, and emotional clarity, built to reveal how manipulative individuals substitute authentic relationship for control, and, as requested, there is no ending sentence. They don't enter relationships to share, they enter to dominate. What they crave is not companionship, not mutual growth, not understanding. What they crave is leverage. They don't want connection. They want control masked as intimacy. When they meet you, their first instinct isn't curiosity, it's calculation. They measure your openness, your empathy, your trauma history. They assess how much you give and how little they'll have to offer in return. Connection requires reciprocity. Control only needs access. They disguise their intentions early on. They mirror your values, pretend to share your worldview, echo your language. It's not sincerity, it's strategy. The faster they seem just like you, the quicker you drop your guard. It feels like bonding. It's actually surveillance. Control seekers don't extract. They'll ask deeply personal questions while offering almost nothing about their own internal life. If they do share, it's often rehearsed, a tragic story packaged to earn sympathy or allegiance, not genuine vulnerability. They are not interested in knowing you as a person. They are interested in mapping you, your habits, triggers, desires, weaknesses. They gather this intel not to connect but to exploit, to predict your reactions, to steer your decisions, to bend you without appearing forceful. Real connection thrives in ambiguity, in the unknown, the evolving, the uncertain. People who crave control cannot tolerate ambiguity, so they push for certainty. What are we? Where is this going? Why didn't you reply right away? These aren't signs of affection. They're signs of a tightening grip. If you set boundaries, they take it as betrayal. If you ask for space, they interpret it as defiance, because to them, love isn't mutual, it's territorial. They believe closeness means ownership, and anything that threatens that ownership must be neutralized. They will often claim to be afraid of abandonment, but that's not the whole truth. What they truly fear is losing control of the narrative. If you walk away, they can no longer sculpt your perception of them. The panic isn't about your absence, it's about the loss of their position as the central voice in your mind. They engineer dependence slowly. Maybe they criticize your friends, isolate you from family, or convince you they're the only one who really gets you. It doesn't feel like isolation, it feels like safety, until you realize how small your world has become. They punish independence. If you succeed, they act insecure. If you're joyful without them, they grow cold. If you pursue your goals, they subtly discourage you, not through direct sabotage, but through doubt cloaked in concern. Are you sure you can handle all that? Don't burn yourself out. Again, the emotional climate around them becomes one of walking on eggshells. You begin to pre-edit your sentences. You calculate the impact of your decisions on their mood. You learn what pleases them and what triggers withdrawal or passive aggression. You aren't connecting, you're managing. They might use guilt, silence, comparison, even kindness as weapons. Kindness, especially, is one of their sharpest tools. They'll do something generous only to use it as leverage later, after everything I've done for you becomes the moral rope around your throat. They demand loyalty but offer none in return. If you express pain, they'll say you're ungrateful. If you ask for change, they'll accuse you of being controlling. They invert reality so they remain the one in charge, even when they're the one causing harm. They'll keep a running tally of your mistakes, real or imagined, and none of your growth ever seems to erase the record. They want you guilty, not healed, because guilt is easier to control than strength. They may even play the role of the wounded healer. They present themselves as someone broken who just needs a little patience, a little extra love. But the healing never comes, because the brokenness isn't the point, it's the mechanism. As long as they're fragile, you're responsible. And as long as you're responsible, they're in control. Their apologies, when they arrive, are hollow and strategic. I'm sorry you feel that way. I guess I'm just the bad guy. These aren't admissions of responsibility. They're manipulations designed to diffuse your anger while maintaining the power dynamic. If you begin to wake up, if you start setting boundaries or reclaiming autonomy, they will escalate, sometimes with love bombing, sometimes with rage, sometimes with sudden emotional collapse, not because they're hurt, but because their system of control is under threat. Their definition of love is ownership. Their version of care is compliance. Their concept of closeness is control disguised as concern. You're not a partner. You're a puppet with the illusion of free movement. Over time, your nervous system adapts to the chaos. You may even feel more comfortable in anxiety than in peace, because they've trained you to associate connection with vigilance, affection with manipulation, and intimacy with erosion. And perhaps the hardest part to admit is that there were moments it felt real, moments of tenderness, moments of warmth. But those weren't signs of love. They were reinforcements of control, strategically released to keep you from walking too far away. Absolutely. Here's an 18-paragraph expansion of They Rewrite Reality, written in a clear, penetrating, psychologically attuned voice, exposing the mechanisms of manipulation used by those who distort truth to maintain power. As you requested, there is no ending sentence. They don't just lie. They restructure the entire narrative. They don't settle for bending the truth. They rebuild it from the ground up, brick by brick, until what's real becomes unrecognizable. And then they hand it to you and say, this is what happened. At first, the changes are small. A word here, a tone there. They say you misheard, that you're too sensitive, that you took it the wrong way. But what they're really doing is testing the edges of your perception. How much will you allow to be edited before you notice the cut? When you recall events differently, they insist their version is correct, not with evidence, but with confidence. They speak louder, firmer, more emotionally, and that power of delivery creates doubt. You think, maybe I'm remembering it wrong. And that's exactly where they want you. They thrive on that sliver of uncertainty, that moment you look inward and second-guess yourself. They don't need you to fully believe them. They just need you to stop trusting yourself. Because once your self-trust is fractured, they can insert their version of reality as your new foundation. This isn't always conscious for them, but it is always intentional. They've learned that controlling perception is more effective than controlling behavior, because if they control what you believe happened, they don't have to control how you respond. Your response becomes automatic. They shift blame effortlessly. If you bring up how they hurt you, they'll say it never happened, or that it wasn't that bad, or that you provoked it. They recast themselves as the victim, the misunderstood one, the reasonable person dealing with an unstable counterpart. You stop confronting them, not because they're right, but because they've made confrontation futile. They remove context to make their story stick. They'll isolate your reactions from the triggers that caused them. You screamed at me, they'll say, but they won't mention the hour of silent cruelty that preceded it. They preserve the facts that serve them and discard the ones that don't. They even rewrite who you are. You're overreactive, jealous, irrational, too emotional, not because those labels are accurate, but because they're useful. Because once they name you, they don't have to listen to you. Your identity becomes the excuse to ignore your truth. They also revise their own past. Their failures are reframed as injustices. Their betrayals become justified responses. Their patterns of harm vanish under the glow of a rewritten origin story. You're not in a relationship with a person, you're in a relationship with their mythology. They don't tell lies to deceive, they tell lies to dominate. Because whoever defines the truth holds the power. And so they'll repeat falsehoods long enough, loudly enough, until others start to nod along just to avoid the friction. Silence becomes compliance. Compliance becomes consensus. They're not content to lie to you, they lie for you. They'll speak on your behalf, interpret your motives, explain your own pain to you in ways that benefit them. You're just saying that because you're scared of being alone. You didn't really mean that. You're projecting. They make you doubt even your inner voice. This manipulation isn't always aggressive. Sometimes it's sweet. Sometimes it's apologetic. I never meant to hurt you becomes I didn't hurt you. I was just trying to protect you becomes you overreacted because you're damaged. The illusion of care makes the gaslighting harder to detect. Over time, you begin to doubt not just your memories, but your instincts. You lose confidence in what you feel, what you saw, what you lived. You start checking in with them before forming opinions. You crave their validation just to feel stable. That dependency is the goal. They dismantle shared reality. With them, there's no common ground. Every disagreement becomes a courtroom where they're judge, jury, and historian. You bring your experience, they bring their revision. You show them wounds, they question whether you bled at all. When you try to leave, they rewrite that too. Suddenly you were unstable, ungrateful, impossible to love. They retell the story to others, how they tried so hard, how they sacrificed so much, how they were endlessly patient, and the truth gets buried under layers of strategic distortion. You find yourself explaining, justifying, proving, not because you owe them an explanation, but because you're trying to recover your own sanity. You want someone, anyone, to believe what really happened. But when reality has been rewritten skillfully enough, even you start to question the script. They don't stop when the relationship ends. They carry their version into the world. They build alliances based on fiction. They turn mutual friends into unwitting accomplices. They recruit sympathy not by sharing facts, but by curating a villain and casting themselves as your savior. What they want is not truth. What they want is control of the truth. And they'll bend, erase, and rebuild as many times as necessary to ensure that the final story serves only them.